welcome and thank you for tuning in to the ninth episode of the WriteHer podcast, a monthly series where two women get together to chat about all things communication. My name is Jillian Brander, content creator and digital media explorer. As always, I'm accompanied by my friend Kathy Douglas, award-winning writer and accredited public relations consultant and owner of Kathy Douglas Communications, Inc. So, welcome, Kathy. Can you believe it? It's our ninth episode.
I cannot. It's gone fast.
That's 9 months. That's time flies when you're having fun on the internet. Oh,
It does.
look at us go. Well, today we're going to be talking about editing. Dun dun dun. What's good writing without good editing? Outlines, rewrites, and tough skin can come in handy when editing or getting your work edited. Today, we're talking about tips and tricks for your editing process that can help you accomplish your communication goals. So, we've had episodes on motherhood, on mentorship, and I feel, writing, but now this is sort of that second phase of editing. So, I think a good place to start is, where do you even start? What has been your editing process been like for you? And how has it adapted over time?
I think that's an excellent question. I mean, I started out in journalism. So, when you're in the newsroom, you have an editor that you report to, who's your assigning editor. And then once that person reviews whatever you've written, then it goes to the copy desk. And then you have maybe one or more copy editors who look at your work before it's published. And over the years, I've gotten much better at anticipating editor questions ahead of time and being able to avoid the early pitfalls that I faced in not explaining things or introducing a random fact that really doesn't have anything to do with anything. So I'm pretty ruthless in editing my own work, and as a result, I don't get a whole lot changed by clients, but it's been a process of decades of doing this. So I think in terms of what has changed is it's very much the same process of in my case, it's a client who reviews the work, then shares it probably with other people who are at the company, and then gets back to me. And sometimes there's a second draft. Oftentimes there isn't. And in some cases, my clients have their own style sheet. So they share that with me, and I have to keep referring to it, who's referred to as doctor and who is referred to with letters after their names, and those kinds of things. So in many cases, it's very much the same. When you know this, working electronically, that whole thing about writing for the web or writing for social media, these are a much different beast than writing a magazine story is. So part of my process has to be putting on that editor hat as I write and being ruthless about cutting down words and making more succinct phrasing and thinking about what I can eliminate. And that's a lot more challenging for me than, writing a longer piece.
When you started journalism, what was one of the first editing like blunders you noticed you would make a bit?
Well, I am terrible with names. As a public relations person, you'd think remembering names is super important, when you're meeting clients and you're out having lunch with people and that kind of thing. I'm notoriously bad with names. Now, this also translates into misspelling names in stories. Now, I remember one editor in particular at the Register I had just started, and he screamed at me in the middle of the newsroom. I had inaccurately spelled one of his mentors' last names. Now, so I learned from that experience, boy, you better check everything twice. And in a couple of days, I'm going to interview this woman who I've actually talked to several times before. And I remember the first time I quoted her, I asked her her name, and she said Amy. And I said, okay, A-M-Y. And she said, oh no, A-I-M-E-E.
MEE.
I was like, well, that's why I ask, because I never could have anticipated that. But a lot of times you won't ask or you'll assume, and those things are deadly. So I think that was my first really bad experience with an editor, was being screamed at in the middle of the newsroom, but he was totally right. It was a terrible mistake and it never should have happened.
Oh, that's so I feel like the editing process and what I've heard from in the newsroom, because you know me, like I do a lot of social copy, marketing copy, very short, quick, trendy, and I can only imagine being in that newsroom and wanting to like my skin wasn't as tough as it was a few years ago, so it's interesting how sometimes we learn the most from those experiences that are
Oh,
pretty
yes, definitely.
drastic, you
It
know?
only had to happen once.
Exactly. It doesn't have to happen all the time. I mean, you learn it once from that experience, and then you go back and you thank that person in 30 years, and you're like, "Thank you for doing that. That really taught me a lesson."
And I do remember the first editor I ever had at the Register. He, in dealing with lots of writers over the years, he had come to the conclusion that none of us knew math. So he had this little one sheet primer for it was like math for journalists. When you're figuring out a percentage, here's what you do with the numbers. When you're looking at median versus mid-range, here are the definitions. This is why they're different. Here's how to figure out which one. I wish I still had that piece of paper because it was invaluable.
It's like the little blackjack card you can take to
That's
like
right.
like Las Vegas, and it has all of the when you should hit. I feel we should really come up with something like that. I feel like that would be valuable for writers today too.
Yeah, a little cheat sheet.
Little cheat sheets and things like that. And that brings up the point that we were talking about earlier of fact checking.
Mhm.
Fact checking. So, have you ever been in an instant, like in a scenario where you're far along with the story and then you realize that a huge portion needs to be checked or maybe inaccurate? And where do
Yes.
you go from there?
So this is why, if at all possible, in your timeline and with your outline and with your drafts and everything, if you can build in time during this process so that you're not rushing at the end. A lot of errors happen when you're rushing
Mhm.
and you just gloss over something because you're in a hurry. But if you build time into the process for review and even going back and re-asking some questions of your sources, it pays for itself over and over again, because at least in my case, most errors happen when either I haven't done enough research to really know what I'm talking about, or two, I'm rushing to try to meet a deadline.
Mm, mhm. That's so important, building those pieces in the editing process.
And
Be
also,
Yeah.
I think if you are questioned by an editor who's just checking facts, it really pays to listen and to make sure that you have the answers to those questions. But fact checking is super important. A lot of magazines employ full-time fact checkers. That's all they do. They review every quote, they review every fact, and only then is a magazine story published. Most of the people that we deal with don't have that kind of budget, but the New Yorker does. So
Yeah, I mean, they have to, right? How do you fact check a quote? Do you literally call up the source and say, "Did you say this on this date?"
yes,
I
yes. I've been
yeah.
back when I was at Chapman, I remember the the Panther student newspaper calling me and saying, this is what we have you saying, and here's the context. Is this accurate? And I was able to say, you took it out of context. What I really meant to say was X and such. Now, sometimes they won't change it. They'll just say, did you say this? Yes, I said it. That's it.
Context.
Sometimes you'll be able to argue back about context. So, but yeah, if you're a good fact checker, you're fact checking everything. So,
What I mean, it's like the Columbo editor. I
yeah,
can't not put more Columbo references in. I don't know.
yes. One more thing.
Yeah.
And, I think one thing that good editors do is rein in the writer in terms of two things. Making sure that you're writing for the right audience. So, like you mentioned, marketing materials.
Mhm.
A marketing piece is meant to, in your case, attract new students or generate new donors or those kinds of things. Well, so the purpose is really clear about what you're writing. You know what the aim is. And then you also know who the audience is. Some things are audience of students and parents. Other things are high rolling alumni or what have you. But you're tailoring whatever you're writing to both the audience and the message. And that's something that, if you just wrote for a newspaper, you'd never have to think about those things.
Right.
But,
It's external. Everybody.
right. Right.
That
So
in the editing process too for social media, that's a huge part of my day is working with our student team that's creating social media copy and social assets and social media specialist who's, strategizing and creating plans for that copy. And it's almost like when you get down, I mean, my experience editing social copy, there's so many things that for search engine optimization and, for things to trend, it's all like the algorithm, like you have to tag certain handles, use certain hashtags, create an experience for people to, you know, have fun through your content, through that edutainment. So it's almost like, well, let's not use that word. Like for example, we recently shared a story about a recent mechanical engineering graduate who, at age 10 was in Vietnam in rice fields with her family. Now she's a mother of three and mother of two autistic children, and that was sort of like the human interest angle that we went with. And so in editing the copy, it's not just so and so wins an award for such and such at such and such. People want to know more and they want to be interested rather than just informed. So that's kind of where,
people like to
yeah,
read about people. You
absolutely.
know, I mean, when I was at the Titan, and people would say, well, we got a story about this program. And I
Yeah.
think that was deadly.
Well,
I can't write a story about your program, but what I can do is write about all the people that the program helps.
exactly.
And then we can get into what the program is as part of the story. But nobody's going to read it if you say, this program does this and this.
Opened on this year and this day, and this was, yeah, we had small
Right.
square
Human,
sandwiches.
human interest is really important.
Yeah, human interest, absolutely. And it's almost, I think that editing process on my end has gotten a lot easier because my social media specialist, she's really great. She's got a quick learning, eye, and um now she's editing content, which is she's never edited content. She's always had her content
Right.
edited for
Right.
her. So teaching someone how to edit is now sort of one of my roles. And, I kind of struggled a lot with self-confidence in writing because I never thought I could do it because the writing process is so intense, but then the editing process is almost twice as hard for me.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, fact checking, and that brings me to my next question. Can you over edit something?
Yes. You can get into that second guessing mode
Mm,
is
mhm,
never ending. So you do at a certain point have to say, this is it. I got to turn it in. Um,
mhm.
with that said, though, I think we touched on this before we started recording, but it's very helpful to me to, when I think I'm finished, set aside a piece of writing, and if possible, sleep on it overnight, come back to it the first thing the next day, and inevitably I'll see things that I missed. I'll see things that I can improve upon. And in that case, that one last edit is really important. But if I hung on to that piece and I just kept going with more and more
Right.
editing, you can make it worse. So you have to know when enough is enough.
And I'm hearing you say that, like, sleep on it, take your time, slow and steady. Like, you're literally, when you come back the next day, how I see it is you are a new editor. You have a fresh perspective. You're not
Exactly.
in your head overthinking it. And I think that's excellent advice. And
Yeah, it's great if you have that time.
if
Now,
you have that time.
if you're on a daily deadline like you are, I mean, you don't have the luxury of sitting on 10 media posts that have to get out that day. I mean, if it's a deadline, it's a deadline and you got to do your best. But if it's a longer piece or something that you can work on gradually and then sleep on it, then so much the better. But, you're talking about comparing apples and oranges in some respects.
Oh, yeah, so true. I mean, I'm grateful to have a really cool team that's, very flexible and quick learning and what we call in the biz, right? Run and gun. Run and gun content. You know,
Right.
we're sort of editing our own content, writing right now for the next magazine, which is fun. And it's so interesting to see how different people edit. Like, I
Mhm.
can give my writing to one person and then they have no notes, and then I give my writing to Mahi and he's like, "Oh, red, let me bring out the red pen. Do we have a highlighter?" So I think my biggest takeaway from editing, just in my perspective, is to have that thick skin. I used to think, "Oh, my writing is so bad that he keeps editing," but at the end of the day, that's the best thing. So I
Well, I'll never
yeah,
forget when I was a junior in college. I was pretty cocky. I mean, by then I'd spent 3 years on the Daily Titan. I'd won awards for my writing. I was a stringer for a daily newspaper. I really thought I was hot, you know what.
nice.
And then I had Gary Granville as my instructor for, it would have been public affairs reporting. And I remember getting the first paper back that I'd written. It was covered in red, just from top to bottom, all these notes. I was so dismayed.
Yeah.
Then I looked at the grade. The grade was A, but there was so much improvement that was possible to make it even better that I really had to swallow my pride. And it was a real comeuppance for me, but it was exactly what I needed to get. I think that was the point when I had Gary as an editor, where I went from being a competent writer to actually having my own voice. He
Hmm.
taught me about voice and about how you can make your writing distinctive. And it's just a cut above adequate, you know?
Yeah, and I mean, would you expand on that? Like, how did your editor help you find your voice?
Well, it was a long process. It wasn't something that just happened overnight, but by asking questions about what I'd written and saying, have you thought about rephrasing it like this? That was one thing that he used to do. Another thing that this was another editor that I had. He always made sure that no lead paragraph was over 30 words. So to this day, I'm almost Medicare age. To this day, I count the words in my lead paragraph. And
Nice.
if it's over 30, I nix it and move on, or I cut it apart,
Um,
part of it the second paragraph, whatever I have to do. But I thought that was a really good rule. Hard and fast rule is, even in a magazine story that's longer, if you get that quick hit and then you expand on it, it makes your writing better. So that was one thing. The other thing is the rephrasing. And then what Gary used to say to us was, show your work. Prove to the reader that you have credibility. And what he meant by that was, if you looked up a public record, you wrote about the fact that you checked this public record and you told what it said. If you interviewed 6 people, you make sure that in your story you show that you interviewed half a dozen people, and so you have credibility. It does 2 things. It proves your credibility, that you know what you're talking about, but it also, because you're quoting different people, you're breaking up a lot of the narrative with quotes. And that just makes it a more interesting story, because people, again, like to read about people. So even if you're talking about a complicated topic, if you're breaking it up with quotes and letting people say what needs to be said, it makes the story more interesting than if you just told them the story.
just, yeah, if you delivered the information versus show them the information.
Right, right. So show your work, establish your credibility, give people the chance to talk in your stories. All those things really helped me kind of develop my own style. I'm still, everybody needs an editor. I still need editing, but I like to think that my copy is cleaner now than it was when I was 21.
I hope than when I was 21.
Yeah.
Yeah, good editors, hard to find. Keep them.
Another thing, you mentioned, how do you become an editor and how do you know what you're doing when you're editing? I think the best thing that you can do as either a writer or an editor is read good writing. And that can be anything from marketing materials that you get in the mail, to a magazine that you happen to read, to the daily newspaper. In your case, following key social media experts and seeing how they word things and how they present information. In that sense, you're learning every day. You're learning everything that you read, you're learning from it. And I think that's really important for somebody like me who's been around the block a few times. You need to keep learning. And one of the ways that you do that is by challenging yourself to read good writing. I just started a book by Truman Capote. I've never read Truman Capote before, but he wrote In Cold Blood, he wrote Breakfast at Tiffany's, a lot of the classics, and had a very distinctive style, which is pretty much all quotations. It's all like people having a conversation. That's how he wrote. And it's very effective because he did it so well. If I tried to do that, I wouldn't be able to do it, but I'm learning a lot about content and presentation through reading a classic.
Right, or like, what was one I used to try to get? Mary Shelley, you know, Frankenstein,
Mm-hmm.
and just sitting there trying to grasp the concepts of this authentic, you know, written word, and tweets are just flying in my head. I have to remember to read good writing.
Yes.
So I'm gonna
Yeah.
check
I
out.
mean, we're busy people. And so the first thing that we drop is reading for pleasure. And that's a shame, because um, part of reading for pleasure is exposing yourself to many different genres and learning from all of it. I just put down another book. It's an audio book that I was reading called The Devil in the White City. And it's a recent bestseller by Eric Larson, who's a very lauded modern author. I had to put it aside because um, it's so negative. It's about a serial killer, one of the first serial killers in America, H. Holmes. And it's juxtaposed. The White City is the Chicago World's Fair. And so you have this guy operating in the city as a monster, essentially. And then you have this group of architects and landscape architects and real brainiacs who are putting on this world's fair. And the juxtaposition is really good, but I finally had to put it down because it was so depressing.
Oh,
I'm sure I will pick it up later, but at the time I thought, I'm going to switch to Truman Capote now.
mm. Oh my gosh, that's like the book A Child Called It. Have you ever heard of that one?
No, I've heard of it, but I don't know what it is.
It's a true story, and it is a very, very sad, sad book. And I mean, it's crazy how, I was reading something about why do we like to watch and read and experience true crime, like why do we find it relaxing? So maybe I sense a true crime storytelling.
Oh yes. Yeah, I would love that. I love true crime. And my husband is so funny because he says, it really bothers me that like you like this stuff. And I said, you just have to worry if I suddenly buy a life insurance policy for
Yeah,
$1 million and then start searching on the internet about how to poison somebody.
I know, right? Don't all the rat poison. Just don't even those olives tasted fine to me. Well, this was fun. We got on the topic of true crime. I feel like that's got to be in our future. But are there any other last minute editing tips you think?
Well, I think one thing that you and I talked about that I think is important to include is and I mentioned this in the blog on which this podcast is based, but there are many tools for good writers. One of them is something that I pay for every month, Grammarly, which, I like to think that I'm good at grammar, but it always catches stuff. And then just spell checking and using the dictionary and the thesaurus, all of those can make you a really good editor.
Absolutely. Fact check everyone. Check your facts. In my interview, I spelled Mike Mahi's name wrong on my
Oh
letter.
no. Oh no.
I spelled Mahi's Michael wrong. I think I switched the A and the E. And I'll always remember that. That almost cost me my job. So you and I are very similar, Kathy. You and I are very similar. So
Right, right.
awesome. Well, thank you, Kathy, for
Oh,
joining
this
me.
was great. I enjoyed
Always,
it.
always, always a pleasure chatting. And thank you out there for listening and watching and joining us for this month's episode of the WriteHer podcast, Tips and Tricks for Good Editing. Share
And
your
let us
writing.
know if there are any other tips that you have that are things that we haven't mentioned.
Absolutely. We want to hear from you, your writing tips, your editing tips, share with the writing community. And check out Kathy's blog for more insight into the writing world and tips that can help you succeed. Check out kathydouglas.com. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.